Welcome to the Northeast Oakland County Historical Museum. Today we're going to be talking about the Cyclone of 1896. Most of the people around Oxford have heard the story over the years, the most common story being told that a monster tornado touched down in northwest Oakland County in the end of May in 1896 and traveled from west to east across the northern tiers of the townships, wiping out farms, the village of Oakwood and the village of Thomas, before turning and going up into Lapeer County, where it eventually lifted from the ground. Today we're going to be talking to Brian and Eric Silkowski. Brian and Eric are working on a documentary about the Cyclone of 1896, what we would call a tornado today, and they're doing deep research, and they're in the production stage of the documentary. Brian, Eric?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Welcome to Oxford History Today. I wanted to talk to you about this story. I mean, it's an interesting story. It's been told down through the lines as the cyclone. Of course, we call it a tornado today. And basically, it's always been a monster storm. And I understand that through your research that you've reached some probably different opinions about exactly what happened on that day in May of 1896. But maybe we should start with how you became interested in producing a documentary about the storm.
Actually, Eric drove that process.
Yeah, I was highly interested in the lack of information regarding an F5 that was listed in a book called Significant Tornadoes, which lasts from about the 1600s all the way to the present, written by Tom Grazulus. And I'd always been going, okay, well, why is it so rare for us to have these tornadoes? And why is there so little information about this? So as we started digging in more and more, I started learning that there's a little bit more to this, a lot more to understand that helps us understand not only the past, but also Michigan's present meteorology, as well as potential future meteorology as well.
Well, we probably should point out you are a meteorologist, so
Yes.
You have the knowledge, education, and the background. And of course, your father is a retired engineer. Like all engineers, he's a nut for details, and he can provide kind of the human story to the event, while you can do the scientific story. And I just find the storm really interesting. And I was kind of surprised to find out that actually the end of May in 1896, it wasn't just Michigan where there was a tornado outbreak. It was actually an outbreak that extended all the way from Texas up through Michigan and through the south in the last 2 weeks of that month.
Right. With that particular month in particular, the Significant Tornadoes indicates that it is one of the most tornadic months in U.S. history. There were 3 F5s in total, and even including the third deadliest tornado in U.S. history to this day that occurred in St. Louis. A very, very active weather pattern for that month.
There's another little piece to that. It wasn't just a wide outbreak from Texas to Michigan and through the southern states and so on, but Michigan, it was a huge front that came through from Detroit all the way up to the Straits of Mackinac. So it was this storm, this huge storm, was a significant part of that whole storm experience, if you will.
Well, it's certainly a major historical event. You being a meteorologist, you've probably done a little bit of study about the storm of 1913, which sank a number of ships on the Great Lakes, and of course these tornadoes in 1896. Are there any other major storm outbreaks that are kind of historical to Michigan?
Yes, we've had a couple minor, they might seem minor to people from the plains, from Oklahoma, Texas, but to us they are pretty spectacular events. June 8th, 1953, the F5 that destroyed parts of Beecher in the Flint area is very noted in Michigan meteorological history. The F5 that struck Hudsonville in 1956 is also notable as well. The outbreak in 97, which is more in our knowledge, in our lifetimes, that struck on June 2nd of that year, is also one of those ones that pops up in conversation quite frequently as far as tornadoes go in this state.
Okay, and now, we think of 1896, over 100 years ago. what could possibly be available to even look and research and to evaluate the storm and take a new look at it. And I know that through your work you found a lot of sources that probably most people wouldn't even think about, and that has probably taken you all over the state to research. What are some of the sources that you've gone to evaluate this storm?
We've been able to locate things like property damage records that have been lodged with the state archives. We have found photographs in university archives at the University of Michigan that have helped us to get a feel for the depth of the damage and for pinning down these events to specific places. Plat maps that are available also through online and through book sources and libraries have also been of great monumental assistance in figuring out how everything kind of flowed through the area and to be able to get a great grasp of where these things occurred.
It brings up a great point, though. One that I would like to sit there and later on, if we can take care of this, is that we're asking people for photographs, remembrances, and the like, and we can provide the contact information to get a hold of us for adding context, giving it more meat on the bone, so to speak, because merely talking about early winds and how fast it went and how much damage is not the story. The story are the people who were affected by this, and there's stories about pianos flying through the air and houses being completely demolished and a woman fighting a fire to save her husband, trying to save him and fight the fire at the same time. I mean, there's a lot of context here. So we want to be able to include as much as possible to give a good picture of this storm.
And I imagine photographs are an important role in your research, not only due for the intensity of what the storm is doing, but the personal stories in a lot of your evaluations.
Yes.
Now you had mentioned to me before that a lot of your information didn't in fact come from weather-related people, but actually came from the health department.
Yes. There were a number of records that were lodged with the State Department of Health back in the late 1800s. They were interested in correlating weather with infectious diseases like typhus, scarlet fever, influenza, and trying to find if there are any correlations with these diseases and the weather. They demanded very accurate weather data throughout the day and throughout the month in order to try to get a feel for these events. That data has been very useful in reconstructing the weather of that day. Things like barometric pressure, humidity, temperature, all are very important to understanding how this storm develops as it moves into the area and how it evolves, and the final piece of the puzzle, the tornado itself.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and maybe we'll pick up on that subject when we come back, because I think we certainly have a lot to talk about.
Canine Stray Rescue is Oxford's own local dog rescue. Call them at 248-628-0435 or go to their website dogsaver.org and click on the Canine Stray Rescue League link.
Welcome back to Oxford History Today. Eric, you're the meteorologist,
Yes.
and I've noticed reading some of the accounts of the 1896 storm that many of the farmers were complaining how dry that month had been. And when the storm was actually coming, they were excited at the prospect of rain for their crops. Maybe you can talk to us generally about some of the weather conditions you would expect prior to a tornado event.
Right. Well, they were examining these conditions prior in the 1880s. Lieutenant John P. Finley was examining the conditions that preceded tornadoes even in that time and came up with rudimentary tornado forecasting. He found that conditions, if it's warming up, if the air is very moist, your barometer's falling, is typically a pretty decent indication that you can have incoming tornadic weather, at least storms at the very least. For them, you'd also see building cumulus clouds. We also saw evidence of that in the State Board of Health records as well. For Ann Arbor, they observed cumulus building throughout the day. That shows you that there's instability, that there's growth in the atmosphere. What you need then is that final trigger, which in that time is very hard to delineate out of the rest of the data. You'd still see the barometer falling, but now the storms are getting serious.
And as a meteorologist, looking at it in the broad perspective about converging weather fronts and things of that nature, what do you look for as a meteorologist with weather data?
Well, we're looking for some kind of trigger. We're looking for a focus, typically a line of convergence where the winds tend to come together, force things like moisture to start pooling and start rising up. If it's all coming together, there's only one way to go, and it's up at the surface. If it's above, of course, it tries to come down instead. The other thing we're looking for is the actual values for these instability values. Instead of just saying, oh, it's hot and muggy, we're looking for values to rise to a specific level. We're also looking for wind shear, winds crossing each other at different levels, or increasing wind with height. We're also looking for, well, that's about it actually. Those are the major pieces.
Okay. And I've noticed sometimes you see video of the storms out west and you see the perfect funnel cloud, and it's easily seen from miles away. And I've been close to a couple tornado events in Michigan through my lifetime, and my recollection always was that it was so stormy you were lucky to be able to see much beyond the front yard, let alone miles away watching a funnel cloud.
Yeah, and that's my experience too. I intercepted a tornado when I was 17 on June 8th, 2003. Actually, it was the 50th anniversary of the Beecher tornado. And we were in the worst of it, raining heavy, could barely see 50 feet in front of you. And here comes an F2 dropping down behind the car, and you didn't hear it, didn't see it, and now here it is. Michigan is very prone to events of that nature, where it's very much hidden in rain, can't see anything, and it surprises you. That was the one big thing with this tornado, was how many people actually did see it at distance.
One other small little piece, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment.
Sure.
Is we just picked up a piece of data yesterday that one of the actual official weather observers for the state, who lived in Thornville, actually saw the tornado 3.5 miles away. Understand, what you see today for terrain is not what you saw then. Most of it was clear cut. Almost all the pictures you see, it's almost completely clear cut, and right for farms and so on and so forth. There are wood lots and so on, but a lot of it has been timbered out, if you will.
It's interesting in that I think it was the account of some people at Pelton Store in Oakwood that as the storm was coming, they didn't even realize it involved a tornado until they started seeing buildings demolished in front of their eyes. So I find it interesting that way, because of that perspective of you think you're going to see a funnel cloud and it just doesn't necessarily happen that way.
Right, you see that with the tri-state tornado in accounts, where it was a very wide tornado, very violent tornado as well, and people were so mesmerized at this site, and it wasn't that traditional funnel cloud, so they were wondering if it was fog, a very fast-moving fog bank. But at the same token too, once it got close enough and you see all the debris that's inside of it, now you know what it is. And sometimes it's very clear cut what it is, and sometimes it very much isn't. And it's very dangerous at times.
I've seen a couple times now where they've compared the tornado of 1896 to the Flint Beecher tornado. And you get different accounts. Some say the Flint Beecher was worse. In deaths and injuries, it certainly was. But some say that actually the 1896 storm was worse than the Flint Beecher. Have you reached any opinion about that?
Not at present. We're still analyzing to determine severity to that degree and try to make the comparison as accurately as possible. There are some similarities. Both storms moved from west to east in their track. Both, of course, were F5s. The Beecher tornado, however, stands out because it's more recent, more fresh in memory. It also is in a more urban environment. A lot more people see it. There's even an observation from the airport in Flushing at that time. Guys rapidly scribbling out, I see a tornado this direction, this time, heading this direction along these roads.
Of course, back in 1896, it was probably relatively rare to have a person trained for observation actually observing these tornadoes in rural areas.
Right. Even with the observation network that we have been able to find, it is pretty sparse even by today's standards. Very limited amount of observation, but still useful in its own regard.
Now, for Oakland County on this this particular storm, where is the first damage actually occurring at?
The first damage is occurring. There's still a little bit of debate on whether or not it occurred just slightly inside Holly Township, along the Holly-Groveland Township borders. However, generally it's said to have started right on the border of the Groveland side of that, and from there it starts moving toward the east. The reason I say that there's a little bit of uncertainty on that is there's a History of Oakland County book that I've uncovered recently that indicates a gentleman by the name of Hadley on the west side of that boundary had fences damaged in 1893 by a cyclone. However, I can find no evidence of a cyclone occurring in that part of the state in 1893 specifically, so time will tell.
Now, on this 1896 storm, of course, they didn't have the F scale then. That's more a modern invention. But initially, what would have been the severity of the storm? Was it like, did it start out really bad, or did it kind of start out somewhat weaker and then build up in intensity?
Even with it, we've determined that it's actually possibly multiple tornadoes. However, even if it was one singular tornado, it all depends upon the damage at one specific spot. You can get almost wide scale of intensities all across a track. How this ultimately goes in the final report, if you will, is the maximum severity seen. However, we see a variety of damage along the path, ranging anywhere from F1 to F2, all the way up to what we believe to be F5 damage.
And following this track, you mentioned that you have the opinion that it's probably multiple tornadoes. Are there actually gaps in the damage, or is the damage pretty much continuous from west to east?
Well, the gaps are pretty small if they are present. It's very hard at smaller scales to see if things are picking up and then moving on, especially because our data is very coarse as far as who's been hit. However, there are indications of the tornado skipping about, which is something you would hear if a tornado was either dying out and occluding and a new tornado pops down in generally the same location as the original and keeps on heading along, or if it's being very sporadic, if it's dying out and kind of getting its act back together, if you will.
Some of the things that you also see is the photos that we've collected so far. You can see some farms that are just completely and utterly scattered across the back 40. And others, we've actually had some photos of the damaged house where, let's say, half the upper story was missing, but it's been repaired and it still exists to this day. And you were bringing up some of the witnesses from Oakwood. A lot of the witness statements, there's always ooch room in their statement. Some of the things that we've actually done is gone back and we have determined, we've gone through great arguments about what time it started. Because of their statements and what they saw, we saw a white thing, we saw a red thing, we saw this happen and so on. And they gave great detail. That helped us actually determine what time of the day it occurred, because this was right around twilight.
Okay. I'd like to come back and talk maybe more specifically about the damage as it moved across the county after just a few minute break here. Welcome back to Oxford History Today. We're talking with Brian and Eric Sokowski about the storm event of May of 1896. Eric, we were talking about the storm originally causing some damage somewhere over the border, probably Groveland, Holly area, and then it's traveling across Groveland Township. Have you determined how many homes and farms might have been affected in its travel across Groveland?
Not specific numbers, unfortunately, but we're still trying to fit the data together, finding out exactly which structures were hit, which are still standing today, which were never impacted. It's a rather tedious process, unfortunately. In some places, were rebuilt after the tornado, so it kind of makes things a little tough at times. In order to get the full data, we have to go through all of the damage reports. We have to look for things like how much damage was done to be reported for monetary reasons. Losses on buildings, losses on barns. You don't want to confuse a house with a barn, obviously. Different damage, different
Value.
different values, of course. Barn's not as much as a house. And as far as specific numbers, unfortunately, we don't have any specifics.
So then, of course, the storm approaches Ortonville, and it starts to become a little bit different story. Of course, the village escapes a direct hit,
Right.
but I think that's where the fatalities really began to start, I think, around Ortonville.
Right. Around the area just to the west and to the east, along that northerly track, you had a lot of fatalities around Thayer Road with the Abram, Quick, and Mitchell families. The Abram Quick family was especially devastated. I believe about 5 or 6 fatalities in that one property area alone.
My understanding, I haven't been to look at it, but I think the cemetery up there, there's some type of memorial to the families that were killed in the tornado, or there's a spot where they're all located? I'm not
entirely too sure.
I've not heard that.
We most likely will be looking more into that as the weather gets a little bit better. It's been quite dreadful as of late.
All right, and then, of course, so then it gets past Ortonville, and it's continuing almost exactly straight east, right?
Yep. And as the tornado kind of weakens, you see a little bit of leaning of the original tornadoes to the north. But another one drops down pretty much in that vicinity of Oakwood Road as the whole system pushes east along it. In the old one tornado model of this, the historical record as it stands today, that would be the case, though, that there would be one tornado just pushing along that road.
And of course, you see accounts of it being at some points half a mile wide, but...
Actually, there's been accounts, if you look at the damage, if you believe the damage, which we can believe it because everybody has had photos of it and so on, there are areas where it was up to 2 miles wide, and that got us to thinking what was occurring here. So that's where we started looking for the multiple tornadoes.
Oh yeah, that's a huge difference.
Oh yeah, tornadoes of that size are rather uncommon. I only know of a handful. Hallam in 2008, some of the Greensburg sequence after the Greensburg F5 reached about 2 miles wide as well, and another, the tragic El Reno tornado of 2013 was also the widest on record, 2.6 miles wide. But even though they can happen, it's a very rare event, so we had to make sure that either we were dealing with extreme rarity or the potential of multiple tornadoes instead.
And you probably took the Hollywood tornadoes into consideration too, right?
Oh yeah.
No sharks.
No sharks.
No sharknadoes. So it's going and it's proceeding across Brandon Township then, after going, and my understanding that the damage there, even though it's in a rural area, is fairly severe.
Extremely catastrophic. Foundation swept clear, and even under the old F scale, you got to be very particular about how it's swept clear. We see photos from even this event where houses are just kind of pushed off the foundation of the structure, but are generally intact. That's not an F1, F2 under the old scale could do that. However, to not only remove it from the foundation, but also scatter it from miles down range, acres and miles, that's an incredible power. That's an F5 in our estimation.
Okay, and you mentioned that part of your hypothesis about it being multiple tornadoes, that as a funnel cloud would be weakening, that it would kind of turn to the left. Would that be due to the rotation of the weakening storm, or?
Yep, it kind of pulls off to the left and up and into the downdraft where all the rain is as it's going on. And it's especially dangerous during this period. They taught it during spotter class way back in the day. They've since gotten a little bit more concise with their training, of course. But storm chasers still talk about if you have a tornado that's weakening and pulling off toward the rain, you got to be very careful where that tornado used to be, because right at that area, you're going to start seeing more new circulation forming. In fact, we started thinking about this right as we were reading a newspaper article, because it says the tornado split between Oakwood and Thomas. And you hear reports of that. People, you might think that people might be seeing multiple vortices and think it's a separate tornado. In this case, the damage records kind of point toward there actually being a second tornado in that region. And it says, oh, one part split off toward Thomas and another toward Mount Clemens. And Mount Clemens is way in the wrong direction for physics to allow in this case. So we looked at this and started going, okay, well, was there just another tornado that kept on steaming down the road?
And now Oakwood, of course, straddled the township line on Baldwin Road.
Yep.
Between Brandon and Oxford. And it's the first, I guess, really populated area that particular storm struck. The damage in Oakwood, does it appear because the storm was more severe at that point, or just more buildings and people there?
Generally, it looks like it's about on target with the intensity around that area. But it's more than likely because of its population, how everything's kind of scrunched in together. You got more houses, more buildings, more opportunities basically for this thing to wreak havoc, if you will. And you see that a lot in areas where rural communities get struck by tornadoes, and the damage, sure, it looks intense, but it doesn't have that same impact or feel that seeing a whole row of houses gone or large areas just completely smashed flat has. Sure, it's all tragic, but when there's a lot more of it, it really just hits home, really hurts.
And I think what surprised me a little bit about Oakwood too is that the Oakwood Cemetery is a fair distance north from the town. In my understanding, you were able to even reach some opinions based upon the damage in the cemetery?
Yep, we believe that there might have been a separate tornado that was pulling north and west of Oakwood as it's the whole storm system is approaching. And it's we see even in the accounts from like the storekeeper that it was near the exact center of town, where they're looking at this big tornado that's moving close by, but then they almost feel like they get surprised from the west as something new is coming in. They say, oh, the church is coming down. That is, to us feels, and we're still evaluating this, of course, that it is a separate tornado that is forming almost on top of the town.
So perhaps the fact that they're not recognizing it is actually their attention is drawn to one, while the other one is actually the more dangerous one for them.
Oh yeah, you even see that in the field of observers where you're looking at the one tornado and suddenly you have to suddenly shift track and go, there's another tornado and it's right on me, and now I gotta get out of here.
Okay. Now, my understanding is you're still in production for the documentary.
Yep.
You're still evaluating and evidence for your hypothesis and producing a documentary. I know there's...
Well, actually, he's also working on a scientific paper as well.
Oh,
Which might get published beforehand, but we'll see on the timing of all that.
okay. Well, I guess it would be fair to appeal to some of the families. We have many families that have lived in the area for a long time, and I'm sure they have family stories or family accounts of what happened during the storm, and perhaps photographs that are stuck away in that box in the attic. If they wanted to share their family stories with you and this documentary about the tornado, how would they get a hold of you?
Company address, email address is probably the best. Emerging Productions, LLC @gmail.com. And I check it quite often, and if you drop me a note, we can make contact and then talk about what you might have, if maybe do an interview or be able to copy some photos. We don't want anybody's photos to own. If we can copy them for the documentary, that's great.
Okay. And maybe we'll continue the subject with the next episode of Oxford History Today. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.